Hey guys, welcome back to the Boxing Deep Dive channel, and in this episode we're going to go back in time to some of the greatest boxing upsets of all time. Now, straight off the bat, I will say this is probably going to open up a can of worms, as it does with a lot of these type of videos. A lot of people have their own opinions. They'll say, well, this upset was bigger than that upset, and how about this one over that one? I get it. These are probably the biggest ones that I've sort of experienced through my lifetime. Well, not all of them, because one goes back to the 1930s, but these are probably the biggest fights that I can remember that affected boxing greatly. Now, no doubt, there's a lot of upsets over the years, of course, all over the world, and they have all different types of ramifications, but these are probably the biggest ones in the world of boxing, and surprisingly, most of them are heavyweight bouts. Now, it's just crazy to think that I know the heavyweight division gets a lot more attention and notoriety over the other divisions. I get that. But it's amazing that the biggest upsets of all time have mostly occurred at heavyweight. And even the honorary mentions that I'll get to after I go through my top 10 feature heavyweights. So, again, I don't know what it is. Maybe the fascination is just a lot more on the heavyweight division. I don't know. But it's just an unbelievable coincidence that most of the biggest upsets of all time have featured heavyweight bouts. Now, as I said before, I understand there's going to be a lot of feedback or opinions, whatever it might be, about people saying, well, this one was better than that one. I get that, as I said. But again, this is just my interpretation of the 10 biggest upsets of all time. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show some footage of the fight themselves and a little bit of information about it. And I'll run through them and we'll put them all up at the end, and then we can discuss from there. And as I said, some honorary mentions as well. So let's get into it. Now, a couple of these will be surprising, by the way, especially this first one. Some fight fans out there might have heard of a couple of these fights before, or the fighters, I'm not sure. But believe me, these are the fights that had the biggest impact as far as world boxing goes. So let's start with, which might be a little bit of a controversial one. We're going to go back to 1986. It is Lloyd Honeyghan with a 6th round upset stoppage of Donald Curry, the Lone Star Cobra. So this fight took place on September 27th, 1986 at the Caesars Hotel and Casino in Atlantic City for the world welterweight title. Now, Curry was 25-0. Honeyghan was actually 27-0, but hadn't really fought anyone of note. His only real meaningful win was a 3rd round stoppage of future champion Gianfranco Rossi the previous year to this, who would go on and win the IBF and WBC super welterweight titles later in his career. Curry had made 7 defenses. This was his 8th. And he, only the year before, had unified the world welterweight title with a stunning 2nd round KO of Milton McCrory. That was for the WBA, WBC, and IBF back in the day. Now, if you're not familiar with Donald Curry, he was the second coming of Sugar Ray Leonard. Leonard had retired 2 years before this. Of course, he would come back a little bit later on. But before this, he'd retired in 84. Thomas Hearns was still sort of finding his way back after some injuries and a couple of losses and everything. Donald Curry was the man. He was all over the boxing magazines. This is back in the days where we didn't have internet, so we had to read magazines. And he was the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world, and no one had heard of Lloyd Honeyghan at all. And it was a stunning upset at the time that had major ripples through the boxing world, because, as I said, Curry was the #1 ranked fighter in the world at the stage. It would be a bit like a total unknown these days, coming in and wiping the floor with Terence Crawford. That's how big it was at the time. So, as I said, it was for the world welterweight title, and Lloyd Honeyghan with a stunning 6th round KO or stoppage. It was a cut eye, but it was from a punch. So Lloyd Honeyghan, who ended up making numerous defences, by the way, ended up being a very, very good fighter. But at the time, no one had heard of him, so a very big upset in the boxing world. Number 9. I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with this one. It was Iran Barkley with a 3rd round knockout. No stoppages here. This was a knockout that took place on June 6th, 1988 at the Las Vegas Hilton for the WBC middleweight title. Now, Hearns was 45-2. Barkley was 24-4. Now, Hearns had just won a record 4th world title, the first fighter ever to win world titles in 4 different weight divisions. He'd stopped one Roldan in four rounds before this fight. Also before that, had won the WBC light heavyweight title with a 10th round knockout of Dennis Andrews. That was in 1987. Not to mention wins in the past over the likes of Pepino Cuevas, Wilfredo Benitez, and Roberto Duran, just to name a few. So on the flip side, Iran Barkley had one shot at the title the year before. He'd lost a 15-round decision to Sumbu Kalambe for the WBA belt. He had a couple of good wins before that leading into this fight. With a 10-round, or a couple of other notable wins, was the 10-round decision over James Kinchin in 86, who was a top-ranked contender at the time, and before this fight, a 5th-round stoppage of Michael Olajide. So that was a bit of an upset as well. But Iran Barkley, with that 24-4 record, hadn't really, fought anyone apart from those couple that I just mentioned, but it was a distinct outsider. Thomas Hearns was at the peak of his powers. As I said, coming off that 4th world title win in 4 different divisions, and was probably in the top 2 or 3 pound for pound fighters in the world at that stage. And just not just that, but also just his status in boxing at that stage. And we all know obviously what he went to do throughout his career, especially after this one. He won numerous world titles after this as well. Did actually suffer another loss to Barkley down the track as well. It wasn't as much of a an upset. Because a few years down the track, Hearns had just won the WBA light heavyweight title over Virgil Hill. And, of course, Iran Barkley moves up in weight and takes that belt off him as well. But at the time in 1988, a massive, massive upset. Let's go to number 8. And this time we're into the heavyweight divisions. It is George Foreman with a 10th round knockout of Michael Moorer. Now, this fight took place on November 5th, 1994 at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. It was for the WBA and IBF heavyweight titles. Moorer 35-0, Foreman 72-4. Now, just a little bit of the background about George Foreman. He'd retired in 1977. Of course, he was a dynamic heavyweight champion back in the 70s. Of course, lost it to Muhammad Ali, but came back in 1987 and actually went 24-0 before he lost a 12-round decision for the heavyweight title to Evander Holyfield in 1991. And in that time, also before this fight, had lost a 12-round decision to Tommy Morrison for the WBO heavyweight title. That was in June 93, so a year before this one. Moorer, on the other hand, was coming off a 12-round decision, probably an upset of his own, over Evander Holyfield. That was just a few months before this fight, and was making his first defence. A massive favourite over George Foreman, 45 years of age, if you will. So an unbelievable performance from George Foreman. And look, he wouldn't have many fights after this one, but didn't matter because this fight was probably, as I said, close to one of the biggest upsets of all time. So that was George Foreman with the 10th round stoppage of Michael Moorer. We're going to stay in the heavyweight division like a lot of these are. And this time we go back to 1935. James Braak, the Cinderella Man, won a 15-round decision over Max Baer. It took place on June 13th, 1935 at Madison Square Garden for the World Heavyweight title. Baer went in with a 40-win, 7-loss record. A lot of those losses have been early in his career, though. Braak had a 49-25-7 record. So he had no business being in this fight with Max Baer, who was coming off 2 devastating knockouts. He'd knocked out Max Schmeling, the fighter that upset Joe Louis a few years earlier. That was in 1934. And in the fight preceding this one against Braak, had absolutely demolished Primo Carnera in 11 rounds to win the world heavyweight title. And he was probably the most feared fighter in the world, an overwhelming favourite over Jimmy Braak, the Cinderella Man. As I said, I've said before, we've all probably seen the movie, The Cinderella Man, and so you all know the struggles that James J. Braak went through. And to win this fight, it was just, as it states here, one of the biggest upsets of all time. Lost the title 2 years later, so he didn't defend it for 2 years. Lost it to the great Joe Louis. No shame in that, of course. And that was pretty much his last fight, bar 1 or 2. So at the time, it was probably a bit like, we'll come a bit later, Buster Douglas beating Mike Tyson at the time. Max Baer, an unbelievably feared fighter, heavyweight champion, of course. And as I said, a major upset. Let's keep going. Let's go to number 6. Still in the heavyweights, like most of these are. This time, we're looking at Michael Spinx with a 15-round decision over Larry Holmes. This fight took place on September 21st, 1985 at the Riviera Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas for the IBF heavyweight title. Now, Holmes was 48-0 going into this fight. He was trying to equal Rocky Marciano's all-time record of 49-0. Spinx was 27-0. Now, Spinx was a great fighter in his own right. He was a reigning light heavyweight champion, but up to this point, no light heavyweight had made the climb to heavyweight and beaten the heavyweight champion. Holmes had made 19 successful defenses. That included the WBC and IBF belts in different reigns, since beating Ken Norton in 1978 for the WBC belt. Now, as I said, Spinx in his own right was a great light heavyweight. He'd made 10 successful defences of that light heavyweight title, but he put on 25 pounds to make weight for this fight, or 11.5 kilograms. So at the time, probably the biggest upset, bar one or two, in the history of heavyweight boxing. And as I said, it hadn't been done before. And Michael Spinx actually repeated the dose a year later in this rivalry between him and Larry Holmes, winning a disputed 15-round decision at the Las Vegas Hilton the following year. So that was Larry Holmes losing his IBF belt to Michael Spinx, the Jinx. All right, continuing on the Spinx name, this time it is big brother Leon Spinx with a 15-round decision win over Muhammad Ali. This fight took place on February 15, 1978. At the Las Vegas Hilton for the world heavyweight title. Now, going into this fight, Muhammad Ali was 55-2. Spinx had only had 7 fights, 6 wins and a draw. Ali had made 10 successful defences of his second reign. Of course, he lost it a few years earlier in that fight with Joe Frazier. He regained the title against George Foreman in 1974, and in that time, since beating Foreman, had beaten the likes of Joe Bugner, Joe Frazier, Jimmy Young, Ken Norton, Ernie Shavers, and was again an overwhelming favourite to win this fight against Leon Spinx, who'd won the gold medal at the Olympics in 1976. So he'd only been pro for 2 years going into this fight and won a unanimous decision. Ali, the legend that he is, would actually turn the tables on this in the rematch between these two, winning a 15-round decision and winning that title for the 3rd time. But in this one, Leon Spinx with a 15-round decision win over Muhammad Ali. And look at the pace these guys are fighting at in the 15th round. So that took place in 1978. Let's jump back to the middleweight division now. This fight took place in 1987, April 6th at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas. Sugar Ray Leonard with an upset 12-round decision over Marvelous Marvin Haggler for the WBC middleweight title. Haggler was 62-2-2. Leonard was 33-1. Now, the interesting thing about this one is that Leonard hadn't fought in almost 3 years. Now, we all know he's an all-time great, one of the greatest pound-for-pound fighters, but he hadn't fought in 3 years. His last fight was a 9th-round stoppage of Kevin Howard in 1984, and only his 3rd fight in 6 years since he beat Thomas Hearns in the 14th round in 1981. Haggler, on the other hand, had made 12 successful defences of the title he won in 1980 over Alan Minter by 3rd-round knockout, and he'd beaten the likes of Vito Antuofermo, Mustafa Hamsho, Juan Roldan, Roberto Duran, Thomas Hearns, John McGubby, to name a few, and was making his 13th defence of that middleweight title. And Sugar Ray Leonard, 3 years out of the ring with the decision win to take the belt. Said he was going to retire again after that fight, but continued on for a few more years after. I think it was 4. Actually, he had his last fight, Terry Norris, in 91, and came back in 97 and got stopped by Hector Camacho. So moving on, we're down to the top 3, and this time it is back to Muhammad Ali, October 30th, 1974, with an 8th-round stoppage of George Foreman. It took place in Kinshasa, Zaire. World heavyweight title. Foreman at the time was 40-0 with 37 knockouts. Ali 44-2. Now, Foreman was coming off brutal knockouts over Joe Frazier, Ken Norton. He also had a 1st-round knockout of Jose Roman in there in another defense of the heavyweight title. So he'd only had 5 rounds of boxing in the last couple of years, but they're all brutal knockouts. Ali had only beaten Joe Fraser 9 months earlier. That was probably his last sort of significant win leading up to this fight. He'd lost a couple of years, the year before this one, to Ken Norton by upset 12-round decision. Had no right to be in there with George Foreman, who was just an absolute animal at the time. No one wanted to fight him. He was, again, like back in the day, the Mike Tyson, the Sonny Listons, these types of guys, the Max Bayers, as I said earlier. Just a feared fighter. And, as I said before, in the Mora fight, George Foreman had his own upset many years later, but in this one, the third, in my opinion, the ranked third highest upset of all time, George Foreman losing the heavyweight title to Muhammad Ali by 8th round knockout. Let's get down to the final two. It features again Muhammad Ali, aka Cassius Clay. This time it's a 6th round stoppage. Technically a 7th round stoppage because it started he retired at the start of the 7th round, but we'll call it a 6th round because we had 6 completed rounds. It took place on February 25th, 1964. Miami Beach, Florida. World heavyweight title at the time. Sonny Liston 35-1. Cassius Clay 19-0. Now, Liston was coming off 2 devastating first-round knockouts of another all-time great, Floyd Patterson. First in the event of winning the world title and then defending the world title. Muhammad Ali, or Cassius Clay at the time, had only sort of 2 significant wins. One was being the 5th round stoppage of Henry Cooper preceding this fight, and a 4th round stoppage of Archie Moore in 1962. But again, Cassius Clay, a massive upset. Only a young fighter. He'd won the Olympic gold medal in 1960, so only a pro for 4 years. And as I said, a massive upset against Charles Sonny Liston. He repeated the dose after this with the Phantom Punch. I think it was the following year after this one with the 1st round stoppage of Sonny Liston. But this fight in particular to go down as the number 2 biggest upset of all time. Which brings us to number 1. And I don't think there's a lot of surprise in this one. Of course, I'm referring to Buster Douglas with a 10th round knockout of Iron Mike Tyson. This fight took place on February 11th, 1990 in Tokyo, Japan. A really weird place to have a heavyweight world title fight. Tyson 37-0 going into the fight. Douglas was 28-4-1. And the biggest thing about this fight is that Buster Douglas was a 42-1 underdog against Tyson, who was making his 10th title defense. He'd won the title with a 2nd round knockout of Trevor Berbick in 86. Was on an absolute tear. Of those 9 defenses that he'd made, he'd also unified the WBA and IBF belts, and was just an absolute wrecking ball on a mission at that time. Douglas, on the other hand, had 1 previous crack at the world title. It was in 1987 against Tony Tucker when he was stopped in 10 rounds for the IBF belt, the vacant belt. That was actually on the undercard of Mike Tyson's defense against Pinkland Thomas. But again, a 42-1 underdog. And you can see there, Buster Douglas creating the biggest upset of all time in the sport of boxing. And to this day, not just the biggest upset in boxing, but one of the biggest upsets in sporting history. So that's number 1. All right, so let's do a bit of a recap of all of them. We'll start at number 10. You can see Lloyd Honeyghan over Donald Curry. Number 9 was Barkley over Hearns. 8 was Foreman over Mora. 7 was Braak over Bayer. 6 was Spinx, Michael Spinx over Larry Holmes. Number 5 was Leon Spinx over Muhammad Ali. 4 was Sugar Ray Leonard over Marvelous Marvin Haggler. Number 3 was Muhammad Ali over George Foreman. Number 2, Cassius Clay over Sonny Liston. And number 1, Buster Douglas over Mike Tyson. Just a few honourable mentions there, guys, before we finish up. Again, mostly heavyweights. Andy Ruiz with the 7th round stoppage over Anthony Joshua. We had Lamont Brewster with a knockout of Vladimir Klitschko. Corey Sanders with a knockout also over Vladimir Klitschko. Hassim Rahman with a knockout of Lennox Lewis. Oliver McCall with a knockout of Lennox Lewis. Frankie Randall with a 12-round decision over Julio Cesar Chavez. Michael Bent with a 1st round knockout of Tommy Morrison. And I think Max Schmeling with a knockout over Joe Lewis was up there as well. So what are your thoughts on the list? Who would you have in there instead of some of these fights I've put in there? As I said at the start, there's probably many other upsets that could probably join the list. But it's just my opinion, and the ones that, in my opinion, affected the boxing world the most. I'm sure there's been other great knockouts over the journey, over many different divisions, but it's probably too many to fit in there. But as I said at the start, these fights, I think, had the biggest impact on the world of boxing. So let me know what you think. Put your list of who you think might have made the list down below. And until next time, thanks for joining in, and we'll catch you then.